Welcome to today's episode of Property Millionaire Coach. I'm your host, Adam Pennisi. I'm currently building a $200 million property portfolio through my development company, AdPen. I started in property over a decade ago at the age of 22, where I developed a $3 million project, and I did this while I was earning $60,000 a year as a graduate engineer. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. If you want free training on how to accumulate multiple properties and how to do property development, go to my website, www.libertyblue.com.au. I also have advanced training courses you can enroll through the website.
Hi guys, my name's Adam Pennisi. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how to find high growth properties and high growth locations. If you like this episode, this video, please like and subscribe for more. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments. I've done a couple $100 million of my own property development projects, and I've learned a few things along the way, which I want to share about growth locations and growth properties. The first one is about growth locations, picking them in the right location, because as you've seen over the last decade, 2 decades, if you pick a good location, the price of property will double, hopefully. You get that maximum growth and that maximum equity, especially if you're holding properties. So I previously hadn't really targeted high growth locations because I was in the business, and I still am in the business of property development. But over time, I've started to hold properties because I've realized that the capital growth actually can make a whole lot more money. You don't have to do any work for it. So property development, you build in instant equity, but over the long term, that equity, that extra capital growth just helps. And it also means that you don't have to, do it, be active. It's a passive strategy. So I can be doing other property development projects, and I'm holding other properties that grow in value without me having to actually physically do the work to build in that equity. So just by default, I've picked high growth locations, and most of that has been off the back of undersupply. With property development, I've always targeted locations that have been in undersupply because I've always wanted to be able to sell the product even in a down market. And I see that as a risk mitigation measure. So just by default, I've bought in really good locations that have gotten growth. And there's things I've learned over time, what to do, what not to do, because I've sold various different properties. And I've also seen what properties in those suburbs have performed. Admittedly, most of the properties I've purchased have been around Brisbane CBD within the 10, 15K ring. I've bought other properties on the outskirts of Brisbane. I've done a whole heap of properties in Ipswich. I've bought some stuff up north as well, in Rockhampton and other parts. So I've been all around, looked at various different markets for a long time. And the common consistent thing is the location gives the property its value. There's no other way to put that. Unfortunately, I hate to admit that real estate agents at auction are correct about location. That is true. However, that is true only to an extent, because it still comes down to the individual property. So when real estate agents talk about it at auction, they actually don't know really what they're talking about. They always talk about location, but they're more talking about the micro location rather than the broad location. And I'll explain the two. So the first one is, think of the map of Australia and have a look at all the growth suburbs. So you can shortlist the growth suburbs using some platforms that scrape data. This data's all captured, and the data I'm talking about is things like rental increase, median price, capital growth, portion of renters, income that they're earning, stock on market, percentage of stock on market. So if you don't know what these things are, or if you haven't heard of them before, that's okay. I'll explain what I mean by all those through the course of this episode. So taking all of those factors and running certain formulas and basically ruling out a whole heap of properties, you're left with, say, the top 5% of properties, top 5% performing properties that look like they're going to perform over the next few years, 5 years, 10 years. So you can do that from an Australia-wide. So you look at data, you look at statistics, and you come up with a short list. So you've got a short list from doing that. That's really great. Happy days. That's one way to do it. This isn't like a bulletproof formula. You've got to then jump into the micro location. So you've done like the broad location, you've picked out 10 suburbs that you want to investigate further. Now you need to deep dive into those 10 suburbs. And this is where it starts to get a bit more on the ground, because property is physical. It's where people live, residential I'm talking about. So people live there, whether they're renting the property or whether they are owner occupiers. Somebody is living in that property, and they've got husband, wife, kids, dog, singles, boarding, whatever it is. We all have to live in a property. It's an essential commodity or essential service that we need a roof over our head. So you got to think about it in that light. So now you start to look at some of the micro location, and the micro location will come down to amenity. The next one, and I like to look at amenity as second. So what is it close to? Over time, properties that are near the CBD have generally grown, had more capital growth than properties further out from the CBD. Property, if you think about it as a whole, really comes off the back of supply and demand. Supply in terms of developed properties, the properties that are supplied to the market, and that also includes listing of secondhand properties. But then there's also the demand, the people coming into that area. So that's all well and good. People talk about supply and demand, but really supply and demand is only going to be out of whack and push the value of properties up if that demand can afford to buy the property. So that's one thing that Sydney's really grappled with. There's plenty of demand in a down market, but people just can't afford to buy the property. So if people can't afford to buy the property, they're not physically going to be able to buy it. And that's what's happened with a lot of parts in Sydney that I've seen, because people have stretched themselves so much, they just can't go any further. So you've got to have cashed up demand, basically. You've got to have people that do have the money to buy it. And you'll see suburbs that have gone into transitions where they've gone from medium price suburbs to now really affluent, high price suburbs. And it's because they've transitioned, the people coming into that area have now got more money. So the demand has been the right type of demand. The same with interstate buyers. I'll talk about Queensland, like people coming up from Sydney and Melbourne, they think Queensland property is cheap. So yes, we've got demand, but we've also got demand that has money. It's all well and good having demand from, say, Brisbane buyers coming up, to Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, and buying property, but they're limited to, Brisbane properties and the value of Brisbane properties. Whereas Sydney and Melbourne, properties there are normally double what they are, or, a fairly high premium of what they are in Queensland. So you've got cashed up demand, and that's just going to push the price up, because people from Sydney go, wow, property's cheap on the Gold Coast. Wow, property's cheap in Brisbane. This property for $600,000, but let's offer them $600,000, and the property might only be worth $550,000. And people in Brisbane are going, oh, this guy's an idiot, he's just paid $600,000. And then another buyer comes up and the agent says, so that one just sold for $600,000. The market's booming. This one's now $610,000. So then this guy goes, oh, $610,000, that's cheap. That same house in Melbourne, that same house in Sydney, that'd be $1 million. So this is only $600,000, and it's getting $500 a week. Like my $1 million house in Sydney, that's getting $500 a week as well. So it's like, oh, this is a great deal. And that's how the market gets pushed up. Now, if it's in Sydney or Melbourne, yeah, the buyers are coming locally, but buyers are coming locally and they still need to, get finance, or if they're cash buyers, get cash. But there's a lot more cash circulating in those capital cities. There's a lot more wealth in Sydney and Melbourne than there are in really the rest of Australia. 3/4 of Australia's property wealth is held in Sydney and Melbourne. So when you see doom and gloom about the media, most of that is off the back of Sydney and Melbourne. So with regards to buying properties that are going to perform really well, you've got to look at amenity. So what is it close to? Is it close to a capital city, which means what types of people are living there? Then you got to look at even the micro of, you've got a suburb, but now drill down into individual properties within that suburb. So individual properties are close to, say, a restaurant or a shop, or are they on a main road? So all of those sub considerations, so all those secondary considerations, you've really got to think about when it comes down to buying an individual property, because you're only buying one property in the whole suburb, and you can still pay too much for one property in a growth suburb and never actually recover your money in 10 years or have very little growth in 10 years. So what you want to do is actually compare sold properties to the one you're looking at that are in similar locations. So you can't compare a property that's in a quiet cul-de-sac to one that's on a main road. Depending on the suburb, there's going to be price differences, and the more affluent suburbs, there's generally more price differences between main roads and cul-de-sacs. The reason being is when you're in more affluent suburbs, if you got a property for say 1.5 million on a main road and you got a property for 2 million on a quiet street, 9 times out of 10, somebody with 1.5 million looking in that suburb, they're going to be able to buy it for 2. They're going to be able to go that extra 500,000 to get something that they want. And then normally as you get higher up, once you start getting over the $3 or $4 million properties, they're cash buyers, or they're very low geared. They've got very low loan to value ratios on those types of properties. So $500,000 when you're talking about a $4 million house, that's not even, that's 10%. If it was me buying a $4 million house and that was my dream home or forever home or home for family, I'm not buying it on a main road. So and I'd be willing to pay $500,000 or $1 million more not to be on a main road in certain pockets. So main road is a big one. I got this wrong on one of my properties where I bought it on the main road, sold it way less than what it should have because I ruled out all the buyers that had cash. So I shot myself in the foot pretty substantially with that. So you got to look at the micro amenity and what it's close to, what buyer objections there are, and how that's going to perform long term. Properties on main roads, they don't perform well long term, and I don't like buying properties on main roads. Just generally speaking, they're harder to sell. They don't perform long term, and so even if you're going to hold it, I still don't like them. And even renters, renters will rent on a main road if they have to, but if they have the option for the same price, they're not going to rent on a main road, especially if you got little kids. You don't want your kids running out on a main road and getting splattered by cars. Speaking from experience, not the splattered by cars bit, but living on a busy road, very dangerous with kids if they get out. For those people that do and don't have kids, you know what I'm talking about. So then, what do you look at? You could look at places that are in quiet streets that are close to amenity, but then with amenities such as restaurants, you want that amenity if that suburb has it, but you don't want to be too close. You don't want to be backing onto a shopping center. You don't want to be backing onto cafes because then that's too close to amenity. You get the noise, you get the smell, you get the foot traffic. So you got to work that out as well. What do people pay less to be right next to a shopping center? And I've known some people, and I actually had the opportunity to buy a house a long time ago, pretty much next to a shopping center, missed out on it. And then 2 months later, the shopping center bought it. So there could be some really good value in buying right next to a shopping center, in that the shopping center buys it off you. But traditionally speaking, I wouldn't bank on that. So I wouldn't rely on the shopping center buying your property necessarily, unless they're expanding in that direction. So those micro things make a big difference to the overall long-term growth of that particular house. And another example of that is like living on the beach. You can be on the beach with a view. Those houses, especially in the last couple of years, have gone through the roof. If you're 1 or 2 streets back, yes, you've had some awesome capital growth, but I can guarantee you, or at least the areas that I've looked at, all the properties right on the beach have had way more capital growth than the ones 1 street back. Like the ones 1 street back might have doubled, the ones on the beach have tripled, and in some instances like quadrupled. Because there's more buyers, that buyer demand just fighting over it because there's less property. So it is really about scarcity, but it has to be scarcity with the right buyer that's coming in with cash, or the bank coming in and valuing your property based on another sale that's happened around the corner, that's on the same side of the road, that's got the beach view or whatever it is. So that's how you pick high growth locations. One, using data from all around Australia to then pick out the high growth locations. but then also then drilling down into those high growth locations and looking at individual streets, individual properties, and working out their amenity and their access to things. But there are a fair amount of factors with regards to that, and I haven't even spoken about the property itself. So you can see I haven't even mentioned how many bedrooms has a property got, how many bathrooms. It's the first thing people normally ask, or they advertise about the property: bedrooms, bathrooms. It's actually the lowest value thing that you need to actually be looking at when it comes to buying high growth properties. Who cares about the bedrooms and the bathrooms? Yes, you've got those fittings and fixtures, and if you're buying a property as a rental property, renters will pay you for number of bedrooms. They're not going to pay you for the land. They'll pay you for number of bedrooms. So you need to have a mix with both. You need to have a property that you can rent out that's got enough bedrooms for the market, but you don't want to be compromising on the property, on the added value created to the land. It's all about the location. Property is immovable. You can't move it, and the value of the land comes from its location, and that's suburb and even specific down to each street. And because of that location and that value that it's given, that long-term capital growth is about the specific location of that one property. It's got nothing to do necessarily with the value of the home itself, although people will put a value on the property because they want to live there, of course. But if you have two houses, identical, 4 bed, 2 bath, one's 10 kilometers from Sydney CBD and the other one's 20 kilometers from Sydney CBD, that comparison, and I'm using quite extremes here, but that comparison, one could be worth double what the other one is, and it's because of the location. And that's using 10 kilometers and 20 kilometers, but even in the same suburbs, I'm sure if you live in the suburb, especially the more affluent ones, you'll know properties that even in the same suburb, similar houses, but one's in a much better location, it'll be worth double, and sometimes even more because of where it's positioned even within that suburb. So that over time, as long as you're buying, in the right market, buying well, that over time is going to have better capital growth than something that's, say, on the main road under a flight path, unless zoning changes, or unless a shopping center buys you. But generally, residential use, I'm not talking about change of use, just talking about general residential property, will always grow better if you get that micro location down to the point. So that's speaking about buying high growth properties that'll perform over time. I haven't given you any specifics. I'm just talking about general. The specifics and the exact formula I do in my program. It does take 6 weeks to get through this stuff, and there is a fair bit of material to get through to make sure that you do it properly and do it right. So I am broad brushing, but the biggest factor, which is going to make a difference whether you buy in a growth location or not, is actually buying under market value. When you buy under market value, you're locking in instant equity. You do have the option to then on-sell that property, realize the capital, and then go again. But if you buy under market value, it means you can refinance that property pretty early. And once you can refinance it, you can go and buy another property, and then you can go and buy another one. And you just rinse and repeat that same cycle. You got to have the structure right. I talk about structuring your property portfolio correctly in another video, and I'll also teach this as part of my programs. If you don't have the structure right, you can't keep buying properties. You're going to get stuck. But the biggest factor, I think, is actually not so much even about the high growth location, although over the long term, that's going to make the difference. But from day one, you want to be buying under market value to build in instant equity, so that then you can use that equity to then buy further properties. Hope that's really helped. If you have any questions, please let us know in the comments, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.